In this lecture, we are going to amplify our understanding of something called the intelligence paradox. This is somewhat a deeper notion about behavioral economics, so first we are going to see the paradox in its condensed form so that later we can unpack all the concepts and ideas that are necessary to its full comprehension. The intelligence paradox can be stated in the following sense. The same cognitive biases that enable the evolution of intelligence in the human brain are the same cognitive biases that hinder that intelligence in modern life situations. The paradoxical nature of this statement lies in the notion that the cognitive biases we have are in great part responsible for our survival over thousands of years of biological evolution, and at the same time, these cognitive biases often catapult us towards irrationality, and therefore away from what we consider intelligence in various examples of our modern social life. Before we can understand this idea more clearly, let's first define the idea of cognitive biases. Metaphorically speaking, a cognitive bias is a lens through which we see the world. This lens steers our thought process, behavior, and decision-making apparatus automatically, so most of the time, we are not aware of such biases. It's common to observe people believe that they are being completely impartial about a given subject, while from the outside, it's perfectly clear that they are biased. We have about 150 cognitive biases, and many of them are critical for the way in which we learn new things and for the way our memory works, which is another way of seeing the intelligence paradox. We need certain biases in order to be able to remember what we learn and recall the new acquired skills when we need to. However, when our biases interfere in our emotions, that's where we can get in trouble, especially when we're dealing with the financial markets. The great question here is why we possess these apparently counterproductive biases in the first place if they seem to cause more trouble than anything else. The problem is that the time span of the existence of modern society compared to the time span of the biological evolution of our brains is tiny. That means that for most of the time, our brains have been naturally selected to deal with primitive problems like avoiding dangerous animals in the wild, tribal fights and things like that. Only very recently we have been forced to learn how to deal with modern life situations like trading, in which we deal with the faults of our own existence in a way. Our biases are very good for primal activities without which would be impossible to learn and develop memory. However, these same biases get in our way when we need to make decisions in an economic paradigm. As we saw in the last lecture about the prospect theory, the decision-making process of traders in the markets attacks the bounded rationality idea in unfortunate ways in all three angles. We have limited information to make decisions in the market, so right from the start, a whole branch of cognitive biases that deal with how we recall memory must be triggered in order for us to indeed make decisions. The second element of the bounded rationality, which is time constraint, also triggers a series of cognitive biases that deal with the notion that we must act fast in our decisions. Evolutionary psychology tells us that we develop this urge to make fast decisions due to the survival paradigm in which our ancestors lived. For example, if you were a human thousands of years ago, and you had to decide about the danger of facing an unknown animal, for example, the humans that made quick decisions were naturally selected over the humans that were not quick enough to make such decisions. Remember that fast decisions are not necessarily good decisions. Quick decisions are made for survival, but trading requires well-thought-out decisions. This is why every trader needs a trade plan, which is a way to make fast decisions based on well-thought-out ideas. This is so important that we define the trade plan as one of the dimensions of a professional trading strategy. The third element of the bounded rationality, which is the cognitive limitation of the decision maker, just sums up what we have been talking about in this lecture. Cognitive limitations can be understood as a combination of how amplified the biases can get with the addition of IQ, which is the cognitive ability to articulate and understand abstract concepts. It's important to notice that we all have the same cognitive biases as we are part of the same species, but our personalities vary greatly, and that serves as a catalyst to amplify certain biases and diminish others. If we bring these concepts to a more practical approach of the markets, we are going to notice that we do irrational things automatically, and that's an incredibly dangerous idea. Since cognitive biases are so deeply embedded in our minds, we don't notice when we are being biased, especially if we don't know there is such a thing called cognitive bias, which is the case of most traders that enter in the market. Just like the subtle points of view detected by the prospect theory, the biases control how our thoughts arise in consciousness and how these thoughts will be steered in a way. In this course, we will study most of the relevant cognitive biases that affect traders the most. By doing that, you will gain an edge over the traders who do not possess this knowledge. Another advantage of studying trading psychology more deeply is that we can take precautions that will enable us to avoid certain psychological pitfalls that are guaranteed to happen in trading. However, before we proceed to study the relevant biases one by one, let's solidify the notion of the intelligence paradox to finish this lecture. We already have a good idea of what cognitive biases are, where they came from, and why they are still sticking around with us to this day and will probably do for a long time. The intelligence paradox states that the Homo sapiens would not have developed high intelligence if these cognitive biases were not present to allow our species to survive long eons of time. At the same time, these biases tend to get in our way in modern life situations that are part of our complex social networks and hinder the intelligence they allowed to develop in the first place. That's the paradox. Intelligence could not have been developed without these primitive lenses to guide our ancestors to overcome their simple problems, but since our species did that sort of thing for a very long time, these biases were deeply engraved in our psychology, and now we must know how to deal with them in a different paradigm, which is the modern world. The problem is that these biases were built and naturally selected by the primitive world. It's almost if we had a primitive sleeping ape inside our minds at all times, and the wrong stimulus from the external world is enough to wake up this creature. The problem is that this creature has no idea how to manage its emotions and it acts completely by instinct and is driven merely by survival. That's the underlying psychological structure that goes on when you see a trader punching his computer screen out of anger towards the market. You can probably imagine that letting this metaphorical sleeping ape trade for you is a really bad idea. In the next lecture, we will begin the fascinating study of the cognitive biases and how deep these psychological traps can get.